Hello, we're back with the book of Philippians. We've finished the introduction and the Thanksgiving, and today we move into the body of the letter, which begins with a focus on Paul's situation in prison and how he feels about that and what that means in terms of his relationship with the Philippians and other Christians as he goes through the challenges that he's facing for their good. One of the first points that he makes is that he sees his imprisonment as being for the greater good. And so in verses 12 through 14, he says, I want you to know, beloved, that what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers and sisters have been made confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, dare to speak the word with greater boldness and without fear. And so Paul sees this time of imprisonment as a potential benefit. Can you imagine if those of us who are currently facing quarantine or self-isolation, can we see this as something great coming out of the challenges that we face now? That was Paul's approach to a moment like this. Is in what ways is the challenge that we're facing now for the greater good? And certainly Paul experienced that to be the case. If we take a look here, this is a potential site of Paul's prison. It may not be the site of Paul's prison, but it is at least something close to the kind of thing he might have experienced. But essentially, it is a stone floor, stone-walled cell without much of anything. And so he certainly was in dire circumstances and not at all in a place of great comfort. And he talks about the whole Praetorian Guard being benefited by what he was going through. These were the Roman soldiers. So remember that Philippians is a Roman colony, that it is a place where retired military leaders have gone to. And Paul's appeal here is that through his imprisonment, even those people who worked for the Roman government, those people who were among the Roman soldiers and military and prison guards, the whole imperial guard, that they are coming to know the gospel. Because of Paul's circumstances of being imprisoned, he has interaction with them, and they encounter in him the presence of the gospel of Jesus, the presence of God's love, and they're being positively impacted, says Paul, through his imprisonment. So not only are they being positively impacted as they experience Paul's message, but also the brothers and sisters or the other Christians. In other words, people are stepping up. Having been made confident by the Lord by my imprisonment, they are speaking the word with greater boldness. So because Paul has been imprisoned because of his sharing the gospel, they are more bold, not less bold, to share the gospel. And so there is good coming out of Paul's circumstances. And then Paul addresses what appears to be perhaps a conflict within the church, that maybe some people are more bold in their preaching because of their love of Paul and of their love of Christ, that because Paul's not able to do as much preaching as he was doing, others are stepping up and filling the void. And then there's some who are concerned that there are those who might be competing with Paul, that they see this as an opportunity. Paul's in prison, and so if Paul is in prison, then it is an opening that I can step up and I can be the new Paul. And would that be something that Paul might be concerned about? Well, if we take a look, it turns out Paul says this does not matter to him at all. Some proclaim Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others do so from goodwill. These proclaim Christ out of love, knowing I have been put here for the defense of the gospel. The others proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but intending to increase my suffering in my imprisonment. So people who are taking advantage of Paul's situation and his inability to be connected to the church might be trying to fill his void for their own selfish gain. But there are some who are doing so to defend the gospel or to be filling the void where Paul used to be able to preach. They're preaching in his stead. Does it matter? What does it matter, Paul says? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true, and in that I rejoice. So Paul's saying whether they are meaning to cause me harm or whether they are meaning to love me in their proclaiming of the gospel, it doesn't matter, because as long as the gospel is being proclaimed, that is what is most important. And so, while in prison, while facing these challenges, perhaps while having some people try to take his place in his absence, he says, I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. How often when we face challenges and suffering do we call to mind the possibility that everything we're going through is for our deliverance? It is to make us better. It is somehow to give us a gift, a grace of God. So I challenge you during this time to find where is it that you can experience gift? What's the gift of God as we go through some of the challenges that we might be going through now? It's my eager expectation, says Paul, and my hope that I will not be put to shame in any way, but that by my speaking with all boldness, Christ will now be exalted, as always in my body, whether by life or by death. This is a really key theme, this idea that we can glorify God whether we live or whether we die. Whether we face uncertain times or we face times of prosperity, whatever we're going through life or through death, is Christ lifted up, and does God's will occur? And for Paul, the source of his joy in this letter to the Philippians is that whatever's happening to him, as long as Christ is being lifted up, then all is increasingly getting better with the world, even if it means he goes through hardship. So Christ will be exalted now as always. For to me, living is Christ and dying is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. And I don't know which I prefer. So here Paul is saying, if I were to die, I could be released from my current suffering. I could have rest in God. But if I live, I might suffer, but it's fruitful. There are good things that come out of my living. I am able to share the gospel with others. I am able to give an example of finding calm and peace in the midst of suffering. I am able to exhort the churches on towards perfection, on towards righteousness, and on towards love for one another. So whether I live or whether I die, it's all gain as long as Christ is the center of our attention. So I am convinced of this, he says. I know that I will remain and continue with all of you for your progress and joy and faith, so that I may share abundantly in your boasting in Christ Jesus when I come to you again. So as he is traveling, he is at this point anticipating a return to Philippi. So if he is in prison at Rome, he's early enough in his imprisonment there that he doesn't expect that he's going to die. Eventually, we'll see in other letters, he expects that he's not going to make it out of prison in Rome. So there is some progress that happens where he's aware that he's likely to die in Rome. But at this point, he still anticipates returning to Philippi. That's either because his Roman imprisonment is going well, or it's because he's actually imprisoned in Caesarea, and he knew in Caesarea that he wasn't going to stay in Caesarea because it was from there that he was hoping to be transferred to Rome so that he might give his case to the emperor as a Roman citizen. So in any case, he's planning on continuing his ministry with the Philippians, whether he's in jail or not in jail, and whether he lives or dies, it's all for Christ. So the only thing that he is primarily concerned about is that they live their life in a manner that's worthy of the gospel, so that whether I come and see you or whether I am absent and I hear about you, I know you're standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel, and are in no way intimidated by your opponents. And why should they be intimidated by their opponents? Paul has more opponents than any of them. And if anybody were to be intimidated, it should be Paul. But here Paul has set an example for them that when things are rough and when their ideas are maybe questioned by others, that there's no reason for them to be intimidated. For them, this is evidence of their destruction, but of your salvation. And this is God's doing. He has graciously granted you the privilege not only of believing in Christ, but suffering for him as well. And it's considered a privilege to suffer for Christ because the image of Christ's love for us is through his suffering on the cross. So when we go through times of suffering, Paul lifts that up as an example to say, this is an opportunity for you to share in the suffering of Christ, and that is in some ways a benefit to you and a privilege. So not only of believing in him, but suffering in him, since you are having the same struggle that you saw that I had, and now I still have. So here Paul is anticipating that the Philippian Christians may undergo persecutions that are similar to the persecutions that he has undergone. And this makes sense, especially if the church is increasingly at odds with the Roman Empire. And that would be the case if this is a letter that's written in the 60s AD. You're beginning to get close to the time of Nero, who detested the Christians. You're also in a city where there's a lot of Roman connections. The retired military leaders are there. So if they do undergo persecution similar to what he has undergone, he is encouraging them. I've gone through this. You'll go through this too. And as you go through the same struggle that I am, I know that you will experience grace and peace, even as I have experienced grace and peace. So that brings us to the end of Paul's circumstances as a prisoner. We're going to continue in the next video looking at a section of the letter to Philippians that includes this what's called a Christological hymn. So we'll look at this famous hymn that talks about the centrality of Christ in our next video as we move on in the body out of Paul's circumstances in prison and in towards his areas of exhortation, including the Christ hymn.